The dark silence of midnight had settled over the old Holloway estate, a mansion hidden deep within a dense forest, miles away from the nearest town. To locals it was known simply as the Whispering House, and no one dared to wander near it after sunset. Some called it cursed, others called it haunted. But there was one thing everyone agreed on. Strange things happened in the Holloway house after dark. Hannah, a young documentary filmmaker, had heard the stories all her life. She'd grown up in the nearby town and, like everyone else, was told as a child to avoid the Holloway estate. But now, driven by a thirst for proof of the paranormal, she was standing in front of its imposing iron gates. The wind picked up, rustling the overgrown ivy climbing the estate's stone walls, whispering secrets in her ear. Hannah took a deep breath, shouldered her camera, and pushed open the heavy iron gate, which creaked in protest as if warning her to stay out. The vast dark house loomed before her, its windows like hollow, watchful eyes. She felt an urge to turn back, but this was her moment. If she could capture real paranormal activity, it could be the breakthrough her career needed. She would be the first to record what truly lay within the Holloway house. The first night. Inside, the mansion was even more unsettling. Dust coated every surface, and the smell of mildew and decay hung thick in the air. Each step Hannah took echoed down the long corridors, swallowed up by the house's silence. Her flashlight flickered across peeling wallpaper and portraits of long-dead Holloway ancestors who seemed to follow her with their hollow eyes. She set up her camera in the grand foyer, its lens pointed at the staircase leading up to the dark, silent upper floors. She decided to sleep there that night, close to her equipment. But sleep was a generous term. Every creak, every groan of the ancient house made her start, her heart pounding, yet the silence was so absolute it almost felt unnatural. Sometime after midnight she woke to a faint sound, a voice. It was low and muffled, more like a whisper, as if someone were speaking from a distant room. Her eyes shot open, heart racing. She strained her ears, barely daring to breathe. "Come, closer." The words were faint, barely audible, but they echoed through the silence of the house, lingering in the cold air. Hannah sat up, her hands shaking as she picked up her flashlight. Was this the proof she'd been searching for, or was she already losing her mind? She followed the whispers down the corridor, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. The voice seemed to drift, leading her deeper into the house. Just as she reached the entrance to the library, the whisper stopped. She pushed open the door, and her flashlight revealed a dusty room lined with ancient leather-bound books. The silence felt oppressive, thick enough to choke. Then a new whisper filled the air, coming from right behind her. "Stay, forever." Hannah whirled around, but the room was empty. She took a shaky breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She had to get control of herself. She couldn't let fear win, not yet. But as she turned to leave, her flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. She stumbled back to her makeshift bed in the foyer, feeling as though she was being watched, the whispers still echoing in her ears. The second night. Hannah spent the next day reviewing the footage from the night before. The whispers were barely there, faint enough that she questioned if she'd even heard them. As dusk fell, she prepared herself for another sleepless night. But tonight she felt even more uneasy, as though the house was watching her, studying her, waiting for her to make a mistake. Around midnight, the whispering began again. "Come, closer." The voice seemed to weave through the walls, drifting down the stairs, beckoning her. She followed it, her camera in hand, feeling as though she were in a trance. This time, the voice led her to the attic, a part of the house that hadn't been disturbed in decades. She climbed the creaking staircase, each step more foreboding than the last. At the top, the door stood slightly ajar, as though it had been waiting for her. The attic was filled with forgotten relics, covered in dust and cobwebs. Her flashlight illuminated a single chair in the center of the room. On it sat an old, cracked mirror. She stepped closer, unable to resist the strange pull it seemed to have. In the reflection, she could see herself, but there was something wrong. Her eyes looked darker, almost hollow, and the faint outline of a figure stood just behind her. Her breath caught, and she spun around. The room was empty. She turned back to the mirror, heart pounding, but the figure was gone. Her own reflection stared back at her, and for a moment she felt as though it wasn't her own face but someone, or something else looking back at her. Then the whisper returned, louder this time, echoing in her mind. "You're one of us now." The word sent a shiver down her spine, and she fled the attic, stumbling down the stairs and back to the foyer. She could barely breathe, her hands shaking as she clutched the camera to her chest. The third night. By now, Hannah was exhausted, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. The whispers seemed to haunt her even when she was awake, lingering in her thoughts, seeping into her dreams. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible would happen if she tried to leave the house. As midnight approached, she found herself in the library where the whispers had first appeared. She turned on the camera, hoping to catch even the faintest evidence of the voice that had haunted her for 2 nights. The whispers started almost immediately, but this time they were louder, clearer, as though whoever or whatever was speaking was right beside her. "Join us!" The voice was low and sinister, each word dripping with malice. Her blood ran cold as the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. She could see her breath in the air, her heart pounding as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Forever, stay with us!" The words seemed to wrap around her, sinking into her skin, filling her with a cold, dark dread. She felt rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to scream. The camera trembled in her hands as she looked around, desperate to find the source of the voice. And then she saw them. Figures barely visible, standing in the shadows at the edge of the room. Their faces were obscured, their forms twisted and unnatural. They moved closer, drifting through the darkness, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Hannah tried to back away, but her feet wouldn't move. She felt as though she were sinking into the floor, the whispers echoing in her mind, filling her with a strange, overwhelming sense of despair. The figures circled her, their whispers growing louder, filling her ears until she thought she would go mad. "Forever, with us." The words reverberated through her, and she felt herself slipping, her thoughts growing hazy, her vision blurring. The last thing she saw was the twisted, haunting faces of the figures closing in around her, their whispers filling the air, drowning out her final, silent scream. Hannah was never seen again. The only evidence of her time in the Holloway house was the camera, found by a hiker years later, lying in the overgrown grass outside the mansion's front gate. The footage was intact, capturing her descent into madness as the whispers took hold of her. They say the Holloway house still whispers to those who dare to enter, calling them, drawing them in, trapping them forever in its dark, haunted halls. And if you listen closely on a quiet, sleepless night, you might just hear her voice whispering alongside them, calling for help. But if anyone had thought to review that footage further, they would have noticed something unsettling at the very end. As the camera lay forgotten on the ground outside the mansion, a shadow moved across the screen. It was faint, but undeniable. A tall, spectral figure gliding just out of view, as though it had been watching the camera this entire time, waiting patiently for its next victim. Then, slowly, the faint sound of whispers filled the audio once again, like a chorus of voices trapped between realms. A cold, shivering chant echoed through the speaker. "Come closer." Months later, another curious soul, a thrill-seeking ghost hunter, arrived at the Holloway estate, intrigued by rumors of Hannah's disappearance and the haunted footage that had circulated online. Armed with new equipment, he set up just as she had, daring the mansion to reveal its secrets. As night fell and silence blanketed the mansion, he felt that familiar chill, the sense of unseen eyes watching from the darkened corridors. The whispers started anew, and as he stood alone in the foyer, he realized he wasn't the first, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. To this day, the Holloway estate stands empty, yet never alone. The townsfolk claim to hear faint cries of terror drifting through the forest on still nights, carried by the wind like a warning. Local legends say the house feeds on those who enter, trapping their souls within its walls, adding them to its ever-growing chorus of voices. The townspeople who live nearby know better than to wander close after dusk, for in the Holloway house, the whispers never truly stop. They only wait.